You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
The family that vacations together stays together. At least, that was the plan. Except now, the dastardly desk clerk is saying he can't confirm your connecting rooms.
Wait, what?
That's right, ma'am. You have rooms 201 and 709.
No, we cannot be 5 floors away from our kids.
The doors have double locks. They'll be fine.
When you want connecting rooms confirmed before you arrive, it matters where you stay.
Welcome to Hilton. I see your connecting rooms are already confirmed.
Hilton, for the stay.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode number 508 of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all. Thanks for tuning into the podcast.
As you guys will recall, we used the last episode to take a closer look at the two armies that would face off during the Atlanta campaign. Although on the federal side, we saw it was actually what today we would call an army group under the command of William Tecumseh Sherman, with the Army of the Cumberland, the Army of the Tennessee, and the Army of the Ohio. While on the Confederate side, there was just the hard luck Army of Tennessee, commanded by Joseph E. Johnston.
And with regard to the Confederates, we've talked about the bad blood between Joe Johnston and Confederate President Jefferson Davis, and how their issues affected the rebel strategy at the start of the Atlanta campaign.
Johnston's decision to wait passively in his defensive works at Rocky Face Ridge, covering Dalton, Georgia, meant that the Confederate commander had yielded the initiative completely to his opponent. Sherman, therefore, enjoyed the great advantage of selecting the time, place, and manner of opening the campaign.
Johnston anticipated that once the advancing Union armies had been dealt a stinging defeat, then he would be able to assume the offensive. However, until Sherman kicked off the campaign, Johnston and the rebels would do little other than continue to drill, rest, strengthen their defenses, and wait.
Several high parallel ridges, the last southernmost fingers of the great Appalachian Mountains, cut diagonally across the northwestern corner of Georgia and extend into northeastern Alabama. These ridges give the whole area the appearance of an old-fashioned washboard or corrugated cardboard. Dalton is situated just to the east of one of those heights. This steep, towering elevation, Rocky Face Ridge, is so named because of the sheer rock wall, or palisade, that scars its western side. It rises about 4 miles northwest of Dalton and stretches south almost 25 miles, almost to the Oostenaula River.
Near its southern end, this ridge fans out to such an extent, some 2.5 miles east to west, that it is, in effect, 3 ridges. The westernmost of these is Horn Mountain, while the center is Mill Creek Mountain. At their highest points, Rocky Face Ridge and Mill Creek Mountain tower about 800 feet above the surrounding valleys, and Horn Mountain about 600 feet.
3 passes offered routes through this mountain barrier. Mill Creek Gap, known locally as Buzzard's Roost, sliced through the ridge immediately northwest of Dalton. The tracks of the Western and Atlantic and a wagon road pass through that opening in Rocky Face Ridge to link Dalton and Chattanooga.
Dug Gap, sometimes called Mill Gap, especially by the Federals, was a man-made crossing that literally notched the top of the ridge about 3 miles north of Mill Creek Gap.
Some 13 miles southwest of Dalton, Snake Creek Gap pierced the ridge. A long, narrow passage, Snake Creek Gap ran from north to south between Horn and Mill Creek Mountains. It led into a more open area near Sugar Valley along the right bank of the Oostenaula River, a short distance west of the little village of Resaca, where the Western and Atlantic crossed the Oostenaula.
Only at these three gaps could an army get through Rocky Face Ridge. The ridge shielded the Confederates at Dalton against any direct attack from the west. However, Rocky Face was only a small part of the strategic position Johnston would have to hold to keep Sherman out of Georgia.
The ridge, in fact, constituted no more than the right center of the long line the rebels had to defend. The right end lay in Crow Valley, directly north of Dalton, while the left end was at Rome, Georgia, some 40 miles southwest of Dalton. The Oostenaula River flows past the southern end of Rocky Face Ridge and then runs off to the southwest. At Rome, some 25 miles from the ridge's southern tip, the Oostenaula joins the Etowah River, which comes out of the southeast. The two streams unite to form the Coosa, which flows west into Alabama and then turns to the south, eventually reaching the Gulf of Mexico at Mobile.
Johnston's true line of defense began in Crow Valley, ran south along Rocky Face Ridge, and then continued down the Oostenaula to Rome. It stretched for a few more miles on down the Coosa.
Rome was also important because of its industry and as a river port and as the western terminus of the Rome Railroad, a branch line that ran east from Rome some 15 miles to join the Western and Atlantic at Kingston, Georgia. Although there was no rail line west of Rome, loss of the town would still sever Johnston's shortest and most direct line of communication with the rebel forces in Alabama.
The Yankees could reach Rome by marching directly south from Chattanooga through the valleys that paralleled Rocky Face Ridge to the west, or by moving southeast from the line of the Tennessee River in North Alabama, across several of the ridges that run through the area.
Once at Rome, the Federals would find no significant barrier between themselves and the rebels' railroad supply line at Kingston. If the Yankees chose to do so, they could move southeast from Rome, up the Etowah, to cut the Western and Atlantic where it crossed that stream.
A strong federal force poised at Rome would make it impossible for the Confederates to remain at Dalton. Johnston's options would be to attack the Yankees at Rome in an effort to drive them away, or retreat into the mountainous region east of Dalton, or fall back southward as rapidly as possible in an effort to keep open his rail link to Atlanta.
If Johnston fell back along the line of the Western and Atlantic, he wouldn't find a spot to halt such a movement north of the Etowah, where the railroad crosses that river. And that point was a good 45 miles south of Dalton, just about halfway between Dalton and Atlanta.
Johnston realized that he couldn't remain at Dalton if the Federals occupied Rome, but he seems to have given no serious thought to dealing with the problem. He made only a few references to the matter in his wartime correspondence, and none at all in his post-war writings.
In 4 months, from late December 1863 to April 1864, Johnston is not known to have visited Rome or any point south of Dalton except for a brief trip to Atlanta in mid-March. He made but little effort to prepare either Rome or the line of the Oostenaula to block a possible enemy advance. And although he was advised to do so by the War Department in Richmond, Johnston didn't try to work out a plan to defend northwestern Georgia in coordination with the Confederate forces in Alabama and Mississippi commanded by the Bishop General Leonidas Polk. Nor did Joe Johnston make any effort to work with state authorities to muster whatever help they could provide.
Joe Johnston obviously let himself get drawn too deeply into the problem of defending Dalton. He seems to have forgotten that he was charged with the protection of Georgia, and instead he became merely the chief of an outpost who focused almost entirely on matters in his immediate vicinity.
Purina believes no one should have to make the impossible choice between their own safety and their pets. But nearly half of domestic abuse survivors delay leaving because they can't bring their pets with them. Through the Purple Leash Project, Purina is helping create more pet-friendly domestic violence shelters so survivors and their pets can escape and heal together. Visit Purina.com/purple to learn more.
All right, listen up, nacho chips. Quiet down, crispy potatoes. This is the moment Velveeta's been preparing you for, and you're not about to crack under pressure. Today's the day to go all in on the drip. Velveeta's Heat and Eat Queso is the MVP of any game day spread, so stick by them, and you'll be golden. Now get out there and make delicious history. No tailgate party is complete without Velveeta.
To be sure, Joe Johnston faced plenty of problems at Dalton. Although the Confederate position there was invulnerable against an attack from the west, thanks to Rocky Face Ridge, it was open to the north in Crow Valley. There, no natural barriers would help the rebels block a Yankee advance.
Sherman could move into Crow Valley by coming directly south from East Tennessee or simply by swinging around the northern end of Rocky Face Ridge. If the Federals could thus reach Dalton, they would flank the Confederate line on the ridge to the west.
Rocky Face Ridge paralleled the Western and Atlantic, the rebels' line of communication and supply back to Atlanta, which further complicated Johnston's problems and weakened his position, since ideally an army's line of communication and supply should run perpendicular to its defensive line. But south of Dalton, all the way to the Oostenaula, the railroad lay but a short distance east of the ridge. So that meant any Federal force that got through Dug Gap or Snake Creek Gap or around the southern end of the ridge or across the Oostenaula downstream from Resaca, well, that enemy force would be positioned to cut the railroad and thus interdict Johnston's line of communication and supply back to Atlanta.
Such an enemy thrust would constitute the same sort of threat, although a more immediate one, as would a Federal force situated at Rome. Should such a force reach and hold the railroad at any point north of the Oostenaula, there was a good chance it would trap the Confederates up at Dalton.
That meant if Joe Johnston wanted to secure his position at Dalton, he'd have to seal the entire Crow Valley, Rocky Face Ridge, Oostenaula, Rome line, and perhaps several miles of the Coosa below Rome as well. That would be a tough job, and it would take complete, accurate, and timely information about the Federals' dispositions, as well as great skill, speed, boldness, and flexibility on Johnston's part.
However, like almost any defensive position, the Confederates' position at Dalton had strengths as well as weaknesses. A bold, energetic rebel commander could find several ways to use Rocky Face Ridge to frustrate an enemy to the west.
The sections of the line along the steep terrain of the ridge itself were so strong that no sane Yankee general would make a serious effort to attack them. The ridge also served as a veritable fortress from behind which the rebels might sally forth and strike isolated detachments of the enemy to the west.
For example, the Confederates might launch quick strikes out from Mill Creek Gap or down from Dug Gap into the area west of the ridge to slow the approach of the Federals or punish their columns.
Good roads and the railroad east of Rocky Face Ridge gave Johnston the advantage of interior lines, allowing him to shift troops quickly between Crow Valley and Resaca to reinforce one or the other end of the ridge.
In fact, the Western and Atlantic gave Johnston the means of moving men from Dalton and the Rocky Face Ridge area all the way down to Rome. For example, troops posted at Resaca were positioned at about the midpoint on the long rebel line and had rail connections to both Crow Valley and Rome.
Rome itself offered a bold Confederate commander a point at which to base troops who would be able to threaten the right flank and rear of any federal force operating against rebel positions near the southern end of Rocky Face Ridge. At the very least, a Confederate force at Rome would be a thorn in the side of any federal thrust aimed at Resaca.
From his base at Dalton, then, Joe Johnston had both problems and opportunities. However, given his very limited view of the situation and his reluctance to run risk, and his strong preference to concentrate his troops under his direct command, and his general lack of initiative, Johnston saw only the problems he was facing rather than the opportunities.
Another commander of a different personality, outlook, temperament, and enjoying a better relationship with his government and his subordinates would have been far more alert to whatever opportunities might come his way, and far more likely to have tried to take advantage of them.
A decade after the war, Johnston wrote that the position the Army occupied at Dalton, quote, had little to recommend it as a defensive one, end quote. He then claimed that he would have abandoned it after he took command of the Army, except the authorities in Richmond hoped that an offensive might be launched from Dalton into Tennessee. In fact, on January 12th, Jefferson Davis wrote to Johnston saying that, quote, the falling back of the Army would be detrimental, both from military and political considerations.
And so, Joe Johnston felt constrained by pressure from above to occupy a position he regarded as weak. But because he didn't trust Jefferson Davis, he explained none of his concerns about the situation to the Confederate President or Secretary of War John Seddon. And because it simply wasn't a part of his nature, he also didn't look for creative, bold ways to take advantage of any opportunities to halt or frustrate the enemy's advance once the campaign began. Instead, Joe Johnston simply busied himself with overseeing the Army of Tennessee's day-to-day operations.
While Joe Johnston busied himself with matters at Dalton, William Tecumseh Sherman had to decide how to execute his role in Ulysses S. Grant's grand strategy for the Federal armies in the spring of 1864.
Sherman's mission was to defeat the Confederate Army in northwest Georgia, or at least to keep those rebels in his front so busy that they couldn't detach troops to reinforce Robert E. Lee's army in Virginia. Grant's instructions to Sherman came in a letter penned on April 4th and were simple enough. Quote, you, I propose to move against Johnston's army, to break it up, and to get into the interior of the enemy's country as far as you can, inflicting all the damage you can against their war resources.
Grant trusted Sherman completely and so left to him the details of how to carry out this mission. And because Grant gave him a free hand, that meant Sherman would have the opportunity in 1864 to put into practice some ideas about waging war that he developed over the past 3 years.
During the first 3 years of the Civil War, William Tecumseh Sherman had not proven himself to be a very good battlefield general. He simply did not, or could not, handle very well all the tactical details involved in commanding a force of any substantial size on a battlefield. In fact, Sherman's preference was to avoid fighting pitched battles if at all possible. In part, this seems to have been the result of his realization that battles were uncertain affairs at best, as they often didn't turn out as those who initiated them envisioned.
Sherman's attitude was likely also due in part to his realization that it had turned out to be almost impossible during the Civil War so far for any army to achieve a quote-unquote decisive battlefield victory. During the war, more often than not, even when an army was beaten, it could usually get away to fight again another day. And in many cases, the victorious army suffered such heavy casualties that it was in no condition to follow up on its battlefield success.
For those reasons, it was unlikely that any large force handled by a general of even mediocre ability could be destroyed in battle. If beaten at all, it would more likely lose through a lengthy process of attrition, which in probability would also force the victor to pay a heavy price, or it would be beaten because its morale had been broken and its men had lost the will to fight, or because the support of the society for which it fought had been cut out from under it.
We'll never know how much of this Sherman consciously understood in April 1864 and how much he only sensed, or why. We do know that he stood apart from almost all of his contemporaries who doggedly plodded along trying to win a great, decisive Napoleonic battle that would settle everything. In January 1864, Sherman stated, quote, "Whenever a result can be achieved without battle, I prefer it."
Sherman believed in the winter of 1863-64, or soon would come to believe, that instead of merely focusing on winning battles, it was more effective to wage war against an entire enemy society, its morale, economy, transportation network, in order to cripple its war effort. And Sherman would end up being the preeminent practitioner of this form of warfare during the Civil War, even as, ironically, in 1864, he was to be presented with two great opportunities when, in all probability, he could have destroyed the army that opposed him, but he let both chances pass.
Although William Tecumseh Sherman may not have handled an army on the battlefield very well, he did have a good grasp of grand strategy and the larger issues of the war that few of his contemporaries could match.
Sherman appreciated the defensive strength of the Confederates' position at Dalton, and he knew from his first moment contemplating the upcoming campaign that he wasn't going to shatter his armies in futile, bloody assaults against it. Sherman, in fact, knew northwestern Georgia better than his counterpart at Dalton. That's because he'd ridden over much of the region in the 1840s, when his duties as an army officer took him there. Before 1864, Johnston, in contrast, had viewed the area only while traveling along the railroad 5 or 6 times.
Studying maps and using his first-hand knowledge of the region, Sherman quickly grasped the importance of Rome. Within a week after assuming command of the military division of the Mississippi, Sherman was making inquiries about possible routes across northeastern Alabama, from the Decatur area to the Coosa River Valley.
Before long, Sherman's plan had taken shape. He would send James McPherson and the Army of the Tennessee from their encampments in northern Alabama and south central Tennessee to the Rome area. Meanwhile, George Thomas with the Army of the Cumberland and John Schofield with the Army of the Ohio would move against the northern end of the Confederate position at Dalton. Their job wasn't to conduct a major attack against Rocky Face Ridge, but rather make a demonstration to distract the rebels there from the threat to Rome and fix them in their Dalton defenses.
Once McPherson entered the Coosa River Valley near Rome, the rebels couldn't remain at Dalton, and so Johnston, Sherman thought, would retreat and probably not make a stand north of the Etowah River. In fact, Sherman anticipated that the Confederate commander would abandon not only Dalton, but also all of North Georgia and fall back all the way to Atlanta.
Years later, several historians would make much of the allegation that in adopting this plan to open the campaign, Sherman violated both the letter and the spirit of Grant's instructions. Sherman, they charged, chose to ignore his primary task, spelled out in the first part of his orders, that is, to break up Johnston's army, in favor of maneuvering so as to carry out the second part, that is, to get into the interior of Georgia. However, Grant's instructions to Sherman need to be understood as general guidelines, not a rigid step-by-step program. In any case, the criticism is much ado about nothing, since Grant knew what Sherman intended, and he could have overruled him if Grant thought it necessary.
And so the maneuvering of McPherson's Army of the Tennessee off to the southwest of Dalton became the key element in Sherman's plan. This even though McPherson hadn't yet proven himself capable of exercising this level of independent command. But McPherson was a favorite of Sherman and of Grant, and the Army of the Tennessee had been Sherman's, and before that, Grant's old command.
Originally, Grant had hoped to have the Federal armies begin their spring campaigns on April 27th. But bad weather in Virginia hampered his preparations there and forced him to push back the date the Army of the Potomac would kick things off against Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Then, at Sherman's request, Grant agreed to a further delay, first until May 2nd, then until the 5th. At noon on April 28th, Sherman left Nashville, transferring his headquarters to Chattanooga and, quote, prepared for taking the field in person, end quote. And some 35 miles southeast of Chattanooga, at Dalton, behind the ramparts of Rocky Face Ridge, Joe Johnston and the Confederates also realized that the time for the opening of the campaign was at hand. And so the much-anticipated great struggle for North Georgia and Atlanta was about to be waged by a general in gray who didn't want to fight except in very specific circumstances, and by a general in blue who preferred not to fight battles at all.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is a back issue of Blue and Gray magazine, specifically Volume 32, Issue 1, from back in 2015.
That issue's feature article is titled Dalton, The Opening of the Georgia Campaign by Robert D. Jenkins, Sr., who was kind enough to get in touch with us recently and provide us with some resources related to the campaign. Bob, in fact, is president of Save the Dalton Battlefields, which has worked with the American Battlefield Trust and other organizations to preserve a number of important sites in the area, and we told him that we'd give Save the Dalton Battlefields a shout-out.
As always, you can find a complete list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Also at the website, you can find info on joining the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and supporting the podcast in that way, just like Harry E. and Anton G. did this past week.
A big thank you to them, and thanks to all of you for listening to this episode. Rich and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.